Have you ever wondered how far you'd go for something you believe in? What if you were told to leave everything behind, holding on to nothing but a promise of an uncertain future? Sounds crazy, right? But that was the reality for Abraham, a regular man called to live an extraordinary journey. He didn't know how things would unfold, yet he chose to follow. So, the question is, was this a display of unshakable faith or pure madness? Abraham faced challenges that few would dare to tackle, leaving his home, giving up security, and at the peak of it all, nearly sacrificing his own son. Anyone would ask, is this really what faith demands? And more importantly, would we be ready to do the same? Abraham's story challenges our beliefs, making us wonder if faith sometimes looks insane at first glance. In the end, is it faith that moves us, or is it the craziness of believing in the impossible? Imagine being in your comfort zone, living your life, and suddenly receiving a call. Not just any call, but one that demands you leave everything behind and step into the unknown. That's exactly what happened to Abraham, or Abram, as he was known then. He received a direct call from God to leave his homeland and head toward a land he didn't even know. God didn't just call him, but also made a grand promise that Abram would be the father of a great nation, and through him, all other nations would be blessed. Can you imagine the weight of that responsibility? It's like your ordinary life suddenly becoming the center of an epic story. What drives someone to leave everything and follow such an uncertain promise? The answer lies in faith. Abraham didn't know how or when this would happen, but he believed. That's the big lesson. Faith isn't about seeing, it's about trusting. Think about the major decisions in your life. How many times did you hesitate because you weren't sure how things would turn out? Abraham, with no guarantees, moved forward. He didn't rely on tangible proof, but on an unwavering belief that God would fulfill what he promised. This belief didn't just shape his destiny, it shaped the destiny of countless generations. Leaving his homeland meant more than just giving up material possessions. Abraham left behind a stable life, friends, family, everything familiar. Who hasn't faced a moment when they had to give up something important in pursuit of something greater? Abraham teaches us that the path to great achievements often demands sacrifice. And in his case, that sacrifice was rewarded in ways he could never have imagined. This promise from God is a defining moment in his story, one that echoes through to this day. It's incredible to think that by obeying this call, Abraham became the father of faith, a title that carries immense meaning because his trust wasn't just a personal victory, it became a lasting example for future generations. Even today, his story is told, studied, and revered. The impact of his actions was so profound that it transcended time. What would it be like if you could make a choice today that influenced countless lives in the future? Abraham did just that without even knowing. God's call to Abraham wasn't just about him. It was about something far greater, something he might not have fully understood at the time. His journey was only beginning, and it was already packed with lessons of faith, courage, and obedience. But what else did God have in store for him? How would this journey of faith unfold? The covenant that was about to come would bring even more surprises for Abraham and his descendants. Abraham's journey took an even deeper turn when he experienced a profound covenant with God. This wasn't just a formal agreement, it was a bond of mutual trust and commitment. God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Now just imagine that. The starry sky is a symbol of a promise. Each star represented a generation that would come from Abraham. It's like visualizing your future on an infinite screen, each light shining as a reminder of an eternal commitment. Who wouldn't feel both honored and challenged by such a promise? But God's covenant with Abraham didn't stop at the promise. There was a symbolic act that would forever mark his life and the lives of his descendants: circumcision. This physical act represented a deep spiritual bond. In other words, God wasn't just asking for superficial obedience. He wanted something that transformed both the inside and the outside. For Abraham, this meant that he and all the men in his household would bear this physical sign of their commitment to the Creator. It wasn't an easy requirement, but once again, Abraham showed his unshakable faith. For him, the covenant with God was worth any sacrifice. As if that wasn't enough, at this moment, God also changed Abram's name to Abraham. The name change might seem like a small detail, but in the culture of that time, names held deep significance. Abram meant exalted father, while Abraham meant father of many nations. And this change wasn't just symbolic. It was a declaration of what was to come. Abraham, who once had no children, now carried the weight and promise of being the father of nations. It's like his own identity had been transformed to reflect his destiny. Haven't we all experienced a point in life where we felt we had to leave behind an old version of ourselves to become something greater? This name change makes us think, how many times in life are we invited to shed our old selves to step into something bigger? Abraham was called to do just that, and his obedience shaped not only his future but the future of all humanity. What might be within our reach if we had the courage to answer the call to change? Often, God offers us a new identity, a new purpose, but it's up to us to accept it and move forward. Abraham accepted the new name and the new mission that came with it. Finally, the covenant established between Abraham and God wasn't just for him. It was a promise that would be passed down from generation to generation. Every descendant of Abraham would carry the mark of the covenant, a constant reminder that they were part of something much greater. And so, Abraham, the father of many nations, saw his life and lineage transformed by this divine pact. But what came next? How would this promise begin to unfold? Abraham and Sarah's lives seemed to be in a long waiting game. The years passed, and God's promise of a son felt more distant with each passing day. Who hasn't felt like time was working against them? Sarah, now elderly, laughed at the thought of bearing a child in her old age. But as God often shows, what seems impossible to man is entirely possible for him. And finally, the miracle happened. Isaac was born. Abraham and Sarah, in the midst of doubt and a prolonged wait, now held in their arms the fulfillment of God's promise, a moment of joy that undoubtedly surpassed any expectations. Isaac's birth wasn't just a personal event, it was a symbol that God always fulfills his promises, no matter how long it takes. How often do we despair when things don't happen on our timeline? Abraham and Sarah, despite the wait, learned that God's timing is perfect. This is a lesson we can apply in our own lives. When things don't go as planned, faith is what keeps us on the right path. Like Abraham, we need to trust that the promises we receive will come to pass, even when they seem impossible. It's interesting to think of Isaac as the embodiment of a promise that once seemed out of reach. His birth brought not only joy but also living proof that God never forgets his word. He acts at the right time and in the right way. This is the kind of trust Abraham and Sarah had to develop. When everything around them said no, they learned to trust in God's yes. How many times in our own lives are we called to wait? And how many times after the wait do we realize that the waiting was part of the process that prepared us to receive the promise? However, Isaac's arrival also brought new challenges. After waiting for so many years, Abraham and Sarah had to adjust their expectations and accept that what seemed impossible had now become reality. Isaac's birth didn't just mean joy, it also represented the responsibility of raising and guiding the child of the promise. It's interesting how sometimes what we desire most comes with challenges we hadn't anticipated. And in this context, Abraham and Sarah had to rely even more on God to raise their son. Isaac's birth, then, marked a crucial turning point in Abraham's journey, but the story didn't end there. God's promise wasn't just for a son, but for a multitude of descendants who would bless the world. Abraham and Sarah still had much to learn and experience, and the future held even more surprises. How would this faith continue to be tested? The next phase of Abraham's life would bring an even greater challenge. Abraham's story took an unexpected turn when God asked him to do something incomprehensible: sacrifice his son Isaac. Imagine the depth of this test. Abraham, who had waited decades for the promise of a son to be fulfilled, was now asked to give that same son back in sacrifice. Abraham's faith had been tested in many ways, but this was undoubtedly the hardest. The question remains, how does someone respond to such a drastic request? Abraham didn't hesitate. He rose, took Isaac, and set out for the place of sacrifice, faithfully following God's command. This obedience is a powerful lesson. How often are we tested in our own lives, and our first instinct is to question or resist? Abraham shows us what it means to truly trust God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense. As Abraham walked toward the sacrifice, he carried not just the wood and knife, but also the emotional weight of an impossible choice. He was willing to obey not because he understood everything, but because he trusted in God's character. And this is where true faith lies, trusting even when everything around you tells you otherwise. At the moment when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, God intervened. An angel called out to him and told him to stop. God provided a ram for the sacrifice, showing that the test wasn't about the act itself, but about Abraham's loyalty and trust. This teaches us that often, God doesn't want the sacrifice itself, but our willingness to give everything we have. Sometimes, the greatest test is being ready to let go without ever actually losing. How often in our lives do we hold on so tightly to something, only to discover that if we had trusted, it would never have been taken away? What makes this story even more touching is the fact that Abraham didn't hide anything from Isaac. On the way to the mountain, Isaac asked his father where the lamb for the sacrifice was, and Abraham replied, "God will provide." This response is full of meaning. Abraham didn't know how things would unfold, but he believed that God would somehow provide a solution. And indeed, he did. This makes us reflect on the times when we are called to believe in what we cannot see, to trust that somehow there will be a provision, even when the path seems dark. This event deeply marked the relationship between Abraham and God, establishing Abraham as the ultimate model of faith. He had passed the hardest test, showing that he was willing to give up even what was most precious to him. But was this the last time Abraham's faith would be tested? What else lay ahead for him and his descendants? Abraham wasn't just a man who lived by faith. He became the father of nations, leaving a legacy that has spanned centuries. His name echoes through history as a symbol of obedience, perseverance, and trust in God. For three of the world's largest monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abraham is a central figure, revered for his close relationship with God and as the spiritual father of many peoples. The impact of Abraham's life goes far beyond his own generation. He shaped the way millions of people, even today, understand faith and the connection with the divine. Abraham's life teaches us that a powerful legacy isn't built just through words but through actions. He didn't just believe in God's promises, he acted on them. This is one of the greatest examples we can draw from his story. In our own lives, we often have the opportunity to create something lasting, something that impacts not just our generation but future ones as well. Abraham was faithful to his calling, and because of that, his story is still told today. What are we building that will be remembered 100 years from now? Our daily actions are planting seeds for the future, just as Abraham did. Being the father of nations isn't just about having physical descendants. Abraham's legacy is also spiritual. He showed us the power of unshakable faith, even in the face of the most challenging situations. His story invites us to reflect on our own journeys of faith. Are we willing to follow God's call, even when we don't understand the path? Abraham faced doubts, fears, and uncertainties, but he never stopped trusting God. And it's this trust that became the foundation for all the nations that arose from him. His faith continues to inspire millions around the world. The most impressive thing about Abraham is that his legacy didn't stop with his own children or grandchildren. Through his lineage came kings, prophets, and even the Messiah, in the case of Christianity. He truly is the father of many nations, and his story continues to be a starting point for discussions about faith and purpose. Abraham is living proof that when we trust God and follow the path he sets for us, our impact can be far greater than we could ever imagine. Even today, thousands of years later, Abraham still influences lives and nations around the world. And yet his journey wasn't without its challenges. Abraham had to face deep dilemmas, personal sacrifices, and tests of faith, and that's what makes him so human. His legacy isn't one of perfection but of perseverance. And maybe that's what makes him so inspiring. He shows us that even in the face of imperfections and weaknesses, we can leave a legacy that transcends generations. But Abraham wasn't the only one to face gigantic challenges in the name of faith. If you think his journey was impressive, just wait until you hear the story of Noah. Imagine being called by God to build a massive ark in a time when no one believed a flood was coming. Noah had to deal with disbelief, criticism, and the pressure of preparing his family and animals for what seemed impossible. How did he manage to stay firm and obey this calling? What can we learn about perseverance and trust by seeing Noah build the ark, a work that defied all expectations? Let's discover this incredible story together.